think that gives everyone a chance to join, so we'll go ahead and make a start. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to Celebrating Shared Global Goals in the Age of Science Diplomacy. My name is Stephen McCarthy. I'm a postdoc in biochemistry at UCI, and my colleague Chechun and I will be moderating the workshop today. Today's event is hosted by UCI GPS STEM, together with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And for those of you who aren't aware of GPS STEM, it's a program based here at UCI for early career researchers that runs events and training programs aimed at developing professional skills and exploring career options. And those of you who are regulars at GPS STEM events will already know that science policy and advocacy are really core components of the program, and we host a lot of events based around these themes. But today's event is going to take that idea just a little further, and we're going to talk about science diplomacy. I believe this is actually GPS STEM's first ever event on this topic, so we're breaking new ground here today. And our motivation for putting this event on really comes from thinking about those of us who perform research probably spend at least some of the time thinking about how our little bit of research that we do fits into the bigger picture, how it relates to some of the bigger challenges that face humanity. So thinking of things like climate change or resources use and public health. And we're aware that solutions to these issues necessarily require policy approaches at a global or international level, as well as the scientific insights that we try and provide through our research. And that sort of international, global level of policy is where science diplomacy really comes in. So to help us learn a bit more about what science diplomacy involves and how it's practiced, we're joined by three excellent speakers today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing their insights and about the work they do, and hopefully there'll be a great discussion afterwards. So I'm going to hand over to the co-moderator, Chechun, to take us through the next part.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Jia. I'm currently a PhD student at UCI, and as Stefan mentioned before, I will be helping to moderate the event today with Stefan together. So this event is organized by UCI GPS STEM and also together with Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adriana. She is currently the CEO and managing publisher of JSPG and will introduce the journal.
Thank you, Jijing and Stephen. Great to be here today. If you'll go to the next slide. So I'm the CEO for the journal. You can follow me on Twitter, Adriana Bankston, and JSPG is at STEaPP Journal. So I want to give you a little bit of background about the journal for those of you that may not be familiar with what we do, and I'll also place our website in the chat. A second, if you can go to the next slide. Great. So we are an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed publication. We cover every corner of science and technology policy and focusing specifically on publishing work from students, postdocs, policy fellows, and early career researchers in science policy. You can find the criteria for submission on our website. Through the journal, we also bolster research and writing credentials for early career scholars in policy and encourage them to engage in discourse and debate. So in that respect, we do publish, but we are more than just a journal and really look to develop also the professional development side for the next generation of leaders in policy. So next slide. Great. So we publish in a variety of formats, OPEDs, technology assessments, policy memos, analyses, etc., and on a number of topics. International science diplomacy is one. A lot of others that apply to research as well as scientific policy. We have a call for papers in STEM education. So there's a number of different topics that you might be interested in. So check out the website as well. We promote the articles in addition to publication through our global mailing list. So I'll share on our channels as well. We do workshops like this, webinars, and also have a podcast where we interview published authors. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel where we post all of our recordings. So we'll post that today's as well. Here's all the channels. And we also have a newsletter where you can keep up to date with our future events and upcoming issues. Next slide. And related to today's topic, we have a recently released, as of 2 days ago, this call for papers on innovations in science diplomacy, structures, policies, and governance for the new decade, with a deadline of April 3rd. So I'll place that in the chat as well. You can check out the call for papers. And we're accepting articles in a variety of formats. The special issue is sponsored by the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy at University of College London, or UCL STEaPP, and supported in kind by outreach partners from the International Network for Government Science Advice, or INCSA, the European Union Science Diplomacy Alliance, and the Global Young Academy Incubator Group on Science Diplomacy in the Americas. So I will place their Twitter handles in the chat as well. Encourage you to follow them. And you'll hear from Marga today, who runs STEaPP Global, which is also a member of the Alliance. Next slide. And leading up to the submission deadline, we will hold 2 webinars and a writing workshop. The webinars are meant to provide high-level discussions with experts in diplomacy that you can participate in and learn about the latest topics. And we also have the writing workshop to help authors prepare for submissions to the issue. We are developing the details for the events, but the registration is open. You can check them out here and register, and we'll send more information later. So with that, next slide. I'd like to introduce JC Mauduit, who is a lecturer in UCL STEaPP, and he also serves as JSPG's Senior Advisor for International Engagement. JC holds a PhD in astrophysics from the Paris Observatory and a master's in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. JC, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Adriana, for the overview of the journal and for the introduction to this wonderful panel. It's my pleasure to be here and say a few words, especially that I'm bridging today 2 of the realms that have been active over the last few years, the science diplomacy community and the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And as some of you may know, I'm passionate about science diplomacy as well as elevating the voice of the younger generation. So I know that both are equally true for panelists today, which share the same passions and interests. And I really want to thank Dr. Brown Berkins, Dr. Sola, and Dr. Halford for being with us today. I know that Stephen's going to properly introduce them very soon, but I just wanted to say that we're very lucky to have in this room today 3 of the most well-respected, influential science diplomacy scholars and practitioners. And I'm very humbled to be able to say a few words of introduction before them. And Mandy, Marga, Melody, I'm also personally very happy to be able to see the 3 of you here today, and I hope we can reconnect in person very soon as well. So talking today in my capacity as an advisor for international engagement for JSPG, I'm very pleased that the journal has been growing quite a lot over the last few years, domestically as well as internationally. It's increasingly gaining worldwide attention, partnering with international institutions, drawing readership and authorship internationally, and looking at policy issues of global relevance. So I'm glad that this year some of the journal's activities will be focusing on science diplomacy, as Dr. Benson and Adriana mentioned, from running a few online events like this one, as well as publishing a special issue around it, and there is actually more to come. I'm very excited about it. So yeah, in terms of context in this workshop, our panelists will walk you through some of the issues that come up when looking at science in the global arena, and in particular within diplomatic processes. And as Stephen, Dr. McCarthy said earlier, science, technology, innovation underpin many of the global issues that the world is facing today, from climate change to the COVID-19 pandemic, which are somber reminders of these issues. And these globalized issues require international responses and diplomatic engagement, which makes science diplomacy extremely relevant and ever more needed. One of the things, however, is that we also know that the world is still missing many of such crucially needed interfaces and bridges between science and diplomacy. We know that we need better structures, better policies, better governance for science diplomacy to be able to address some of these complex worldwide problems. And we also know that this needs to happen fast, and that we need to mobilize as many people as possible to do so. And every idea matters, every innovative idea matters. And we know that there are still intergenerational barriers and gaps that to bring these ideas to the fore. And I hope, and we hope that JSPG will enable some of that. So I hope that this first foray, which might be a first foray for some of you, I don't know, we'll hear from you, the audience, at some point, into the world of science diplomacy and its complexities will spur your interest in continuing to explore it and engage with it. I will let our panelists go into more detail, but science diplomacy as a field of research is relatively new, but in a way it is an old practice. And looking back at some of the known milestones, such as the Antarctica Treaty, which we're celebrating today, and deriving lessons learned from it for the future is invaluable. So this is what I believe today is about, and I really look forward to it. So thank you all for being here. So over to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks for that, JC. It's time for our first speaker. I should say, before we go to the speakers, if you have a question that arises from anything the speakers discuss, feel free to type it in the chat box. And if there's time at the end of the talk, we'll put them to our speakers and you get a response. So with that, I'm going to introduce our very first speaker, which is Dr. Margarel Sola. She is the founder of STEaPP Global, an advisory research firm connecting science, technology, and diplomacy. And she's going to speak to us today about the Antarctic Treaty and its lasting effects in science diplomacy. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much. Stephen, could you let me share my screen, please? Great. Just 1 second. Let's see if this works. Okay, is there, let me know if I succeeded in sharing.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this invitation. Thanks to the organizers and everybody involved. I know this was a long time in preparation, and it's really wonderful to be here with friends, with JC, with Melody, with Mandy, in this very special day. So today is as JC already advanced, is the anniversary of the Antarctic Treaty, which we consider one of the milestones and landmarks in science diplomacy. And so there's no better theme, we think, to introduce this topic to you than explain some of those milestones and landmarks. So we are not going to today go into much of the theory of science diplomacy, but we're just going to dive through the examples, and hopefully then we can derive the lessons for the current and future challenges. And before I start, I also want to congratulate the journal on the new call. It's really fantastic. I work a lot with governments, with UN agencies to build those science diplomacy mechanisms, research, but also building them and helping countries strengthen those interfaces. So I'm really looking forward to the submissions and see what comes out of it that we don't know yet. So innovations in other countries that are outside of our radar. So I'm really looking forward to the publication, and let me know how can I help. So the day is special for me, not just because it's a wonderful, the Antarctic Treaty is a wonderful example of science diplomacy, but actually 2 years ago I was there and I had the pleasure and the privilege to celebrate the 60 years of the signature of the Antarctic Treaty in Antarctica. And we say 60 because there's two anniversaries, the anniversary of the signing of the treaty and then the anniversary of the ratification, which is when it entered into force. And we will explain what all these words mean. But basically in 1959, the treaty was signed, and then 60 years later in 2019, we celebrated the first anniversary, the first 60 years. And so I was there, and this is a picture of me with an expedition, a Women in Science expedition, which was the largest women in STEM delegation ever to go to Antarctica. And this has many, I think, implications and dimensions that I think Melody will talk more about later in terms of inclusion, and how polar exploration and scientific exploration in the poles was always a very masculine endeavor. And so, you know, we are also carrying this idea of inclusion and gender equality with us everywhere we go, and of course to Antarctica. So the Antarctic Treaty, why is it this milestone and this landmark example of science diplomacy? 1959, if you situate yourself there, many of us were not born, but this was the height of the Cold War. After World War II, the world was was charged with geopolitical tensions. But one event happened in 1957 and 58, and this was the International Geophysical Year. And that is when 12 countries, the flags that you see in this slide, some of them are no longer these countries, they have evolved, but these were the origin, the first 12 nations that decided to send their scientists to Antarctica to conduct research for a year. And those scientists from these 12 countries, they realized after that year that model had worked really, really well. They were able to collaborate, they were sharing data, they were sharing equipment, they were basically acting as one community. And they realized that the best way forward for Antarctica to be able to, so we would be able to research and to understand Antarctica and also preserve it for future generation, was to keep this governance model forever, meaning that science would become the primary form of governance. So Antarctica had no borders, no countries, no political lines. It was still a land to be, you know, either divided and colonized like every other part of the world we have done, or maybe think of something different, preserve it as what we then would know as the global commons. So a part of the planet that belongs to all of us. And there is no central government, but we can agree to a set of principles, and those set of principles will guide our collective management of that area. So you see here some flags, and those are the stations and the scientific infrastructures that were built at the time, and that now have become the research stations and the bases that each country operates, but according to very specific principles. And I will share with you, just for the exercise that's coming right after the breakout groups, what those principles are. And I don't know why this slide is blank. Hold on a second. It should not be. It's actually, okay, just hold on, because it's supposed to be there, but it's not. So let me try again. Okay. Are you seeing a picture with a list of with the list of principles? Okay, then I'll use that. Okay, so sorry about that. So what were those 14 principles that were that became the articles of the Antarctic Treaty? And the treaty means that it is an international agreement that basically is legally binding. So countries, when they sign it and ratify it, meaning that their national legislation agrees to it domestically, it becomes international law, and it becomes also domestic law. So this is really important to understand, because we will talk about the different ways we can arrange agreements on different topics, environmental topics, health topics. But it is important to understand the difference between what is legally binding or not, because then it means what can we hold countries accountable for, and what level of intervention can we have if somebody doesn't comply. So the Antarctic Treaty was built on those principles, right? It is in the interest of all mankind, humankind, to preserve it as it is, pristine and for future generations. It can only be used for peaceful purposes. That means there are no military applications allowed. There are no nuclear testing or waste disposal. So there's nothing that you can do in there that doesn't have a peaceful goal. Very important principle, freedom of scientific investigation. Anyone can go and research anything that they like in Antarctica, providing that they have the means and the logistics to go there. And the basic form of conducting this is through international cooperation and transparent data sharing. So every experiment, every result, all the data that's generated in Antarctica, no matter who does it, if it's the US scientist, the Spanish scientist, or the Chinese scientist, or the Russian scientist, it has to be made freely available, transparently for everyone. There are no basis for territorial claims, so it doesn't. If you build a research station in Antarctica, that doesn't mean that you are claiming that part for you, for your country. And very importantly, you allow, so you agree to inspections by other members by other parties, by other countries, to come and check what you're doing. So you always have the door open in your research vessel, in your laboratory, because anyone from another party, another country that signed the agreement can come and check you, can see their labs, can see your experiments, your lab books, and they can check that you're doing what you're saying that you're doing. And so the overall, of course, principle is that these principles are in line with the United Nations Charter for the global good. So, and then I think one more is the one about disputes. So if there's any disagreement, you commit to resolving that by peaceful means. So why we're telling you this is because in the second part of the workshop, there's someone with a mic open, sorry. So we're telling you this because in the second part of the workshop, we would like to put this into practice. So let me go back to the presentation. So after you've heard from Melody and from Mandy, remember those principles because we're going to play with them a little bit. And so this is Antarctica. Antarctic Treaty is one of the longest environmental agreements that we have, and we're still alive today. And we celebrate it today because those values of peaceful cooperation, of scientific transparency and integrity, and all of the values that are enshrined in that treaty are actually incredibly relevant for the types of negotiations that we have to undergo today. And we'll talk about the health, how this applies to global health, and this will be an exercise that we'll do together. But there is not just Antarctica. There are many other global commons and parts of the planet that need this type of protection as well. So for instance, the ocean, we have 2/3 of the ocean that doesn't belong to any national jurisdiction. So basically what we call the high seas and also the deep sea, these are also global commons. And so that means that if the only way to manage them and to govern them is to come up with these joint approaches and joint frameworks, normally through the United Nations, that allow us to manage them collectively. And as you see, this is very obvious with the ocean because all of the light blue is the high seas, and only the dark blue is actually the portion that belongs to any national, any state. And this is going to be very important for when Melody talks to you about the Arctic, because Antarctica and the Arctic have different models, because Antarctica is basically a piece of land surrounded by ocean, but the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land. And there's a key difference that makes Antarctica easier to protect in that sense, is that Antarctica has no indigenous people. So nobody lived in Antarctica when we first humans came to decide what to do with it. But of course, the Arctic has many more layers of complexity, and Melody will talk about them. Another very interesting example is the Montreal Protocol. This is the agreement that allowed us to close the hole in the ozone layer. If you remember, in the 80s, we had this really concerning development over Antarctica, actually, that these compounds, chemicals called CFCs, you will remember they were in, I don't know, maybe you're too young, but they were in spray cans, in refrigerators, in cars. So the emissions of these toxic compounds were causing the hole in the ozone layer, and obviously that had huge potential consequences for human health. So it was something that directly was going to threat human health, and so scientists raised the alarm, and policymakers and politicians took up that warning, took it to the UN, and they devised an agreement that would phase out those toxic components, the CFCs. And importantly, because industry was also on board, companies agreed to stop making those chemicals because this was an opportunity for them to innovate and replace those CFCs with new chemicals, new components that would be better for business, and also would not be environmentally harmful. So this already begins to show you that for science diplomacy to be successful, you need a triangle of science telling us what's happening, governments and diplomats taking up the proposal and actually doing something at the multilateral level in the form of an international agreement or treaty or convention, and then industry agreeing to also change their model. And this is very relevant because when we think about climate change and we see that action is much slower and much more difficult because we don't yet have this alignment, right? And we don't have the private sector and the companies, fossil fuel companies that are so fast on board with this transition. And so my last word is on this idea of managing the global commons and what we are dealing today with COVID is whether health can be considered a global public good, just like Antarctica, just like the oceans, just like space or the air that we breathe. So if health is a global public good, then the way we manage, for instance, COVID-19 or any pandemic of the future needs to take into account all of these principles that we just discussed. And so now the WHO and the World Health Assembly is right now in Geneva starting negotiations for a pandemic treaty. And a pandemic treaty would be a legally binding agreement that would force countries to report their data, to allow inspections in their labs, in their hospitals, and being told what to do. And that means giving up a little bit of sovereignty in the favor of the common good. And of course, that will bring many different challenges because not all countries are going to be on board. So this is the exercise that we're going to discuss. We're kind of drawing on these lessons from the past and from these successful examples of science diplomacy. How do we bring them into the future? So here we have, like, you know, the science has never been more on the headlines in terms of global cooperation, but also political and diplomatic strain. So we're going to talk about that, and I'll just stop here because I'm out of time. So thank you so much, and over to Melody.
That was great. Thank you so much for that, Marga. Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Mandy Halford. Oh, no, Melody's up next. Okay. My mistake. Okay. Our next speaker is Dr. Melody Brown Berkins, who, as you can see, is Director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth University. And she's going to talk to us today about inclusive science diplomacy. So over to you, Melody.
Hi, thanks everyone for letting me be here. You're going to get, in between two Antarctic discussions, you're going to get a wee bit of Antarctic, then also to the Arctic, as Marga explained, there are some interesting pieces of inclusive science diplomacy that I'm very excited to see will be part of your future webinars as well in February. So that was nice to see from Adriana when she presented that. So in my presentation, I wanted to first let you know, just say why I talk about this in Arctic knowledge and inclusive science diplomacy, and this will help you think about the exercise we get to later, is that I don't think, and JC actually mentioned this, Mauduit said this very well, we will not achieve our collective global goals for all that we're trying to do if we do not relentlessly pursue a more inclusive, equitable, and informed approach to our knowledge creation. We need these structures and institutions and protocols that center inclusion if we're going to have the future we want. and the protocols that I'm going to show you for Arctic science cooperation and diplomacy that were established by the creation of the Arctic Council, centers Arctic indigenous peoples and knowledge systems in the framework, and that provides to me a powerful roadmap for more effective, impactful, and sustainable solutions to our global challenges through this more inclusive science diplomacy. So I'll just center you that I'm actually from the Arctic. I'm from Alaska and loved growing up there. It's a beautiful state, but I did work in Antarctica. So to tie all these ideas together, this is the Antarctic dry valleys where I did my PhD. Some of you have been there. I'll give you a little map to see where those dry valleys are. They're ancient fjords. I studied nematodes. I was a polar biogeochemist and was looking at way back when in the 90s, when we actually still knew climate change was real. We talked about climate change affecting polar global ecosystems. And you can see these little tiny critters. That was the largest one on the Antarctic continent. I worked with a great team of people, an incredible international scientific collaboration, because that is what Antarctica is about. But one of the things that really I wanted to bring in here is that Antarctica also taught me about science diplomacy, not just in a way of, that we were cooperating, but the strategy of science diplomacy. And that's because we were visited by a group of US senators. You're way too young to know this, but Senator Ted Stevens was actually from Alaska, and he was the head of appropriations in the US Senate. And that is the committee that tells you where the money is going throughout the United States and the world. And he didn't know if the money should be going to Antarctica. So they put me with, when he visited my valley, they asked me to walk around with him to show him that Alaskan science was being done in Antarctica. And I was essentially a science diplomat to a US senator. I didn't know how to do that well. And they didn't really pay attention to me, but I did see someone from a US National Science Foundation come in and show me how it was done. This person was an informed science policy and diplomacy professional. We didn't have those terms, but this person started talking to the senators about budgetary, how the value to the budget, the return on investment, the economic development potential of the knowledge that we were creating, how this helped the United States have a status in the world while it was, protecting conserving the environment of Antarctica and understanding the science cooperation, but also having a presence there and having bases and being able to move around the continent. These were powerful symbols of US presence. They were terms that I had never, ever heard before, because I was a scientist and I was creating knowledge. And these were terms that were what the politicians cared about, and the people who handled and actually said what would happen with our money, and who held the strings to that scientific cooperation and the governance of science cooperation. And this really set me on the path that I took. I won't go into it, but essentially I started to become a science diplomat. And I ended up in a beautiful place that lets me do this, Dartmouth. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies, but in a place called the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. Our mission is to create young people who want to go out and help be part of understanding the world's troubles and become better humans in that effort. So it's quite a mission statement for us to do, and I'm very privileged to be here. So let me move to the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council, get a little history in just a moment, but if you don't know that it exists, the governance for science cooperation and interactions in the Arctic is, again, it has people in it, and this is the Arctic Council, is the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation, coordination, and interaction among the Arctic states. Those are things like Finland and the US and Sweden. There's 8 who have Arctic territories, but also Arctic indigenous communities and other Arctic inhabitants. And they all work together on common Arctic issues, in particular, the sustainable development and environmental protection of the Arctic. Just a quick history, the Inuit of indigenous communities, almost 160,000 people right now in the Arctic, formed a conference in 1977 to think about these issues. And then in Russia in 1987, the Murmansk speech by Mikhail Gorbachev proposed that the Arctic would become a zone of peace where the nations could collaborate on these environmental issues through science and other peaceful processes. Finland and Canada originally took the lead. And then in 1991, Finland's Rovaniemi Declaration on the protection of the Arctic environment moved this all forward. And in 1996 in Canada, there was the Ottawa Declaration that established the Arctic Council, a high-level intergovernmental forum to address common challenges in the circumpolar north. It was not a treaty. It was a forum and an establishment of this sort of principles and a declaration, which is different. It can create legally binding ideas, but those are somewhat separate from the Arctic. Those are products of the Council and are rare. Oops, I'm not sure how I somehow did not able to turn the next slide, but I will figure that out in just 1 second. Here we go. So this is what an Arctic Council, this is actually a ministerial in Iqaluit, which is in northern Canada, looked like. And what you're going to see, I think I'm going to show you a few pictures, but see if you can pick up what may look different. First of all, it's often in a circle or a box, and that is intentional to show that everyone is equal around the table. This is a SDWG, or a Sustainable Development Working Group meeting in Chena Hot Springs. It's just outside of where I was born I was born in Fairbanks, Alaska. This is a senior Arctic officials meeting in Juneau, Alaska. When the United States held there's a rotating chairmanship every 2 years with the different Arctic states. And what I want to do, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the interesting things about the Arctic Council is that it has both member states. And if you looked around the table, you also saw people often in traditional dress, because the 8 member states, Canada, Kingdom of Denmark, which includes Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, United States, they can create treaties and do those things. But the Arctic Council at the same table includes the permanent participants, which are the indigenous peoples of the North. They have a place at the table, and all agreements, I'll go through the list here. This is how they operate, is through inclusion and participation and respect. And that includes consensus decision-making, as I mentioned, prioritizing the co-production of knowledge. I'll talk about that in just a second. Centering inclusion, equity, and human rights in the research approaches and the methods. This is still pending, but their work is to figure out how to compensate knowledge holders. So yes, we all get, when we do research, we get paid as part of our job, but what about those from whom we take knowledge in indigenous communities? How are they compensated for that knowledge they bring to our work? And how do we ensure free, prior, informed consent and uphold the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous people? Again, when we work with those communities and we take knowledge, how are we actually making sure that they receive benefits of that knowledge, and also that knowledge isn't taken against their will? So inclusive science diplomacy in 2017, this was actually how the Arctic knowledge is brought in, was in the 2017 Arctic Council Fairbanks Declaration, again, my hometown. There was language that talked about how science cooperation was promised in this agreement. It was an international agreement and did come into force, just as Margot was talking. These are agreements that actually have protocols and signatures by high-level folks. What I'm going to talk about is quickly is that Article 9, specifically I was talking about in terms of inclusive science diplomacy, said the parties will encourage traditional and local knowledge inclusion as in addition to Western or traditional sciences. So this is a huge issue. This means that if you're working in the Arctic, you can't just go in with your lab methods and things you may have learned in your college or university. You have to also understand how to incorporate and how to work with indigenous knowledge holders. And it's a really steep learning curve for all of us, but it's prioritized right now in the last few agreements with the Arctic Council and in Arctic science. This is UArctic, which is a University of the Arctic, over 200 groups in the circumpolar north thinking about research and education. You can see inclusion and respect and collaboration are part of their principles. They were actually created by the Arctic Council. EU PolarNet, the European Union, when it has workshops, thinks about co-creating Arctic research with indigenous rights holders. I'm just giving you some examples to show this isn't just on paper. People are implementing this, and it's taking a lot of work. We're all trying to learn together. How do we co-create knowledge? The United States National Science Foundation is investing in this for its major priority for getting Arctic research. It's created both in Alaska. They've created a group with community engagement that has both an Indigenous Advisory Board and a Research Advisory Board. In my Institute of Arctic Studies, we're trying to do this as well. We are the crossroads for multidisciplinary Arctic scholarship and policy that center inclusion, justice, equity, and Arctic indigenous knowledge in our solutions to global challenges, and that is our science diplomacy. And so I'll just show some examples. I won't take too long, but Fulbright Arctic has indigenous and non-indigenous folks that we've worked with. The Dartmouth Institute of Arctic Studies helped with a Greenland-US cooperation document by the National Science Foundation. and the Greenlandic ministries. And you can see it was actually published not only in English, but also in, and I can't say it right, Kalalusit, for Greenland citizens. And then we're actually moving on a Lancet Commission on Arctic Health. This gets to the health issues that is co-led by both the Inuit Circumpolar Council, that's Dr. Daly Sambodoro, and Lisa Adams up in the upper left of that picture. Lisa Adams is here at Dartmouth, a traditionally Western scientist, and Daly is a PhD in Alaska who represents the Inuit Circumpolar Council and their knowledge. So to end, if we want more sustainable, inclusive, and equitable solutions with our science diplomacy, we must approach those challenges with more sustainable, inclusive, and equitable knowledge systems and governance structures for the health of our planet. And I'm sorry, sometimes I can't go forward, my apologies. And the Arctic Council emphasizes this inclusivity, cooperation, and governance structure that I think provides a powerful model and roadmap for future science diplomacy agreements. So that's my thanks. And we'll move on to the next person. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Melody. In the interest of time, I'd like to invite you just to hold your questions. There'll be a little quick Q&A for all three of our speakers at the end. So just hold on to them for now. But as a reminder, you can also type them in the chat and our speakers will see them and you'll be able to look at them in advance. So with that, we'll move on to our final speaker, Dr. Mandy Halford. Mandy is an associate professor at Hunter College in the American Museum of Natural History and the CUNY Graduate Center. And she's going to give us a presentation on the oceans and the 3 Gs, gender, geography, and generations. So Mandy, if you're able to take over.
Yes. Hi, everyone. We're really excited to be here with you. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. You've heard already 2 really stellar talks from my friends Marga and Melody to sort of set the platform for what we wanted to walk you through today as an introduction to what science diplomacy is and the different areas in which we work. And so Marga started us with Antarctica, the bottom of the globe. Melanie drove us to the top of the globe with the Arctic. And I'm sort of going to connect us all with the oceans because that's sort of where my area is. I work in the oceans. And so if I can share screen, I will get that. Yeah, you can see it there. Let's just hit play. Yeah. So, and what I want to talk to you specifically about a little bit is about the Decades of the Oceans, which is a new initiative that started 2020 with the UN, officially started January of this year, though, on gender, and it applies to all of the oceans. And there's a tag that goes along when we talk about the Decades of the Oceans that a colleague of mine sort of phrased called geography, gender, and generations. And so I'm going to paraphrase everything I talk about with the oceans and the treaties and everything with those 3 lenses, looking at geography, gender, and generations. And just a little bit more about why I'm interested in the oceans. So I practice my very own killer snail diplomacy, which is really about blue biotech. So I work on venomous marine snails, and I use them as a conduit to not only understand the evolution of these fascinating organisms and how they have venom, like snakes or scorpions or spiders, but also how we can use the components in their venom for discovering novel therapies that are helpful, particularly in areas in cancer, my focus, but you can help with any human disorders or disease. And so
hi, Mandy, sorry to bother you. There seems to be a little pop-up box on your screen. That's the way. I don't know if that's
I don't see it.
Oh, okay. It says warnings.
Warnings on my screen?
There aren't any warnings.
We had a fire drill already. There can't be more warnings.
I don't. We can see it. So it's, yeah, right there. That's it.
Okay, I think I got it.
Got it. Sorry to bother you with that.
It's all right. No, we don't want the screen popping up. It's good. So in my work in particular, the oceans are important because the oceans actually are one of the biggest source for natural products discovery. We know very little about the compounds that are housed within the organisms in the ocean. And so the idea that leading forwards in this next decade of the ocean, one of the big things that we will probably be launching on is how do we build blue biotech, and how do we do that in a way that it gives value to not only the people who have the capacity to build the research and development that's necessary, but the places where these organisms come from. So in my case, most of my critters are tropical marine environment organisms. And so I don't find them here in New York. I fly off to places like Papua New Guinea, like Panama, like the Philippines to collect and cultivate these organisms. And so it brings in this whole discussion about what is going on beyond the scientific collaboration that I'm having with my colleagues when we go on a field work, to the science diplomacy that has to happen at a higher level with institutions, as Margarel was describing to you before, that allows me to even get into some of these nations in terms of import-export permits and all of these other things. And so the oceans, while many people, when they think about the oceans in a policy realm, they either think about fisheries or they think about conservation, there is also the realm about biotechnology and building, IPs and building economic capacity and building STEM capacity using the what we find in the oceans. And so that's sort of my focus. And here's what my critters do. I have to show you, I'm like a proud parent. This is the snail hidden under the sand. This orange tongue is a proboscis. It will come out and it will then inject venom essentially into this fish, and it will allow the snail to basically have a meal. This is real time. We have not sped it up. And so when you think of this in the context of science diplomacy, sometimes the fish is a scientist and the snail is the government agents that are trying to use them, or it could be the snail is the scientist and the fish could be the agents that the scientist is trying to manipulate. Either one is not correct, right? But we want to have a place in which science diplomacy is a real partnership between scientists and policymakers in a way that we can bridge and understand and build and support each of those really thriving enterprises, right? So you'll see this again. This is Conus bullatus. Once the venom is injected into the fish, it goes completely still and then it gets swallowed up whole. Again, we don't want any analogies of the scientist being the fish. We really want, when we go into science diplomacy, that science has a part to play, right? We can't replace politicians. We can't become the snail, but we have a part to play in building effective policies, especially in areas in where the topics have science and technology at their core, right? Like climate and everything else that we've been talking about today on the anniversary of the Antarctic Treaty. Happy birthday, Antarctica. I love your title, Marga. And so this is some of the products that have come from what we do, which is basically natural products development from venom. And you'll see that the cone snail has produced, the first drug from the cone snail is from Conus magus, and it's used to treat chronic pain in HIV and cancer patients. It's a breakthrough drug simply because you can treat pain without addiction, right? So that's why there's this excitement about what we might be able to find in the sea, because here we are finding compounds that are giving us novel treatments using novel mechanisms without some of the very horrific side effects that can happen. The one major one from pain being addiction, because it's still very much morphine that is the one that is mostly being used to treat pain around the world. And so there's a really, really big potential in building the capacity for blue biotech. And as I said, I'm highlighting here where my organisms come from when we go out on collection trips. But as you'll see, a lot of the research and discovery is happening in the northern hemisphere for the most part, but a lot of these organisms are found in the southern hemisphere. So how, when we talk about the decade of the oceans, do we make sure that everyone is that, all the ships rises with the tide, basically is a nice way to say it. And that we're not sort of exaggerating this divide between North and South. And we really want to make it something that is beyond just a scientific collaboration and into like a science diplomacy. So when we think about, a nice way to think about the difference between policy and diplomacy is that policy is usually national, whereas diplomacy is international, right? So in this case, when we're talking about the decades of the ocean, this is international policy that has to come about based on national interests. And Elva is the colleague who talks about it in the terms of geography, gender, and generations. And that's how I'm gonna try to lay it out to you right now. When we talk about geography, it's the fact that all of us are touched by the oceans, right? Regardless of where we live. And so there is a UN Convention of the Law of the Sea which about 100, I think it's now 160 something nations have signed or ratified. And can you guess which nation has not done so? For me anyway, I am sitting in that nation. Both me and Melody are sitting in that nation. So the US has not ratified this treaty as of yet, but it is one that is being adopted to help us control sort of what happens in the high seas. So in the figure that you're seeing there, it shows you what's considered the high seas. The high seas are what's outside of, 200 meters from any natural border, right? And so within the 200 meters, you have exclusive economic zone. This is where nations can claim whatever is found within those regions belong to them, right? In terms of fisheries or new discoveries of animals and all of those things. Once you get beyond that, you're now into what we call the high seas. And in the high seas, there are no agreements about who owns what and what can be developed and what can be used to build capacity in terms of both economic or within science itself, within STEM building capacities, right? So this convention of the law of the seas from the UN is supposed to help, with conservation and ocean resource management, supposed to help with, coastal sovereignty and all of those things when we think about it in the broader sense of trying to build capacity in general. And so we'll see when we talk in an exercise that we're going to start in a few minutes, we're going to see the different treaties that you've heard so far, the ones from the Arctic, not the Arctic, it's not a treaty, the document from the Arctic, the Antarctic Treaty, and then this new UN Convention of the Law, how those can be manifested to address some of a current science diplomacy problem in terms of global health and the vaccines. Gender is an issue in the decade of science because usually you might think of, when you think of gender and the oceans, I on purpose use this hyper guy with muscles because generally people think it's a male, ocean liners, fisheries, all of these things are male-centered activities, but it's not true, as we all know, right? The oceans, when women use it, we usually use it in ways that cultivate and support family. So women will use shells as currency in markets. They will do all these things from which the ocean provides meals. They sell the fish in the market. They don't necessarily catch it. So we want to include that when we talk about the oceans and we talk about these policies, we want to consider that gender is very important and making policies that are inclusive of all genders is sort of the goal. And then we get to generations. Generations, of course, speaks to the fact that right now we have a very, very vocal youth activist group that are out there. And from the climate change conference that just happened, they're very vocal in trying to support what happens and what gets passed down to them and how they're involved. So when we think about policymaking, especially on a global scale, we want to ensure that we're not making policies for the people who are in the room, right? Who's usually a demographic of white male of a certain age. We're not trying to make a policy for these people. We're trying to make policy that's inclusive of everyone and will also be forward spanning, future spanning, so that we're looking at generations to come. And that's part of the big issues of what is going on when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, which you'll be introduced to again in this exercise that we did. These are 17 goals put forth by the UN to try to really sort of lift all ships, right, with a rising tide. And they vary from ending poverty as number 1 to number 17, partnerships for the goals, and number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, right? So it's a broad gambit of what I like to call the periodic table of policy, because it looks very much like the periodic table of elements. The periodic table of policy is this wish list for how we can, as a whole, devise treaties and other things that will lead to sustainable development throughout the whole continent. And so we've all been invaded by this virus, this thing on the screen, the coronavirus, and it has dramatically altered and changed everything that I've said that came before. So it's like, the effect of, it's had this amazing butterfly effect of rippling through not only science, but policy and everyday practice, as you are well aware. And in the case of how nations are treating each other, the global health initiatives that are being developed around the coronavirus is really a case study for science diplomacy, especially when you start to think about vaccine diplomacy, right? And how which nations have the vaccines, which nations do not, how is it being administered, where should it be going? And then in a particular problem that I wanted to mention was the development that is very vital right now, as we're talking about the new variant that's out there and it being identified first in South Africa. The idea that Western countries may or may not have prevented African countries from having their own vaccine developed. This was a Professor Happy who works at the African Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases. And a while back, he had identified a potential vaccine that would work for the strain of the virus that they had found on in Africa doing their own sort of genomic studies, but he couldn't get funds to get it to clinical trials because already we had developed, you know, the Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine, and these were all being sent to Africa. So Africans were told or were under the impression that you have what you need and you perhaps don't need to develop in-house. Now we see perhaps that might not be the best way to go. But this is all, again, all up for discussion. And I wanted to just give a quick history on what used to be considered, and still is sort of the guiding line for the dimensions of science diplomacy, advising and not advocating. So this is actions designed to directly advance this country's national needs when the scientist goes to their national government and help them to figure out policy issues. Engaging, so actions primarily designed to meet global needs and challenges. This is when nations will come together to build things like the space station, to build things like CERN and other things which scientists can then use to advance science, but can on their own make. And then the last part of confidence building, right? So this is where scientists will work, like, for example, American scientists will go to North Korea to work on volcanoes and things like that, or in the interest of trying to build a capacity in terms of building first a friendship that can then lead to diplomats speaking to each other and things like that. So these are actions designed to address cross-border interests, right? And so when you're thinking about your treaty and when you're thinking about how science diplomacy occurs, it has all of these components in it, right? So who's giving the advice? How is it enabling scientists, enabling countries, and how is it helping to perhaps build new partnerships when we could not have it there? And in the US, we have different agencies that are considered science diplomacy actors. And when we think about this on a global scale, you know, this slide could be very crowded with logos, but just to give you, again, a quick background. And then who's doing this work? There's different private sector scientists at the bench, doctors, and different kinds of global multinational institutions like the United Nations. So I'm going to end right there, and I think we are going to take questions and then start in on our exercise, right? Yeah.
Thanks for that, Mandy. That was a really great talk. In the interest of time, we might just go straight to breakouts. Okay. But for those of you watching, all our speakers will be staying around for the duration of the event. So if you have some questions you'd like to ask them, feel free to put them in the chat and or ask them yourself. They'll be around. So yeah.
And before we go to the breakouts, I don't think we're gone yet. I just wanted to give everyone a quick overview. Who haven't used Mural, you're going to go to a space that looks somewhat similar to this. And if you look up in the upper right, it says yellow, blue, or green, 1, 2, or 3. Your breakout group should go click on one of those, the yellow, the blue, it'll take you and magnify which group you're going to be in. When you're in the space, I'm going to give you everyone the link in just a minute. Can everyone see this screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Oh, good. Just double checking. Then when you're in the screen, just so you know, if you tap things, if you pinch and pull, you should be able to open and make bigger and smaller. If you tap, you'll probably get like a little sticky that you can add places, but you can move the little sticky. If you see these little dots and squares around, you're going to be looking at some major pieces of the various SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the Arctic Council protocols, and the Antarctic Treaty pieces. You're going to be looking at them and you're going to be dragging them up with your team to see which ones you want to cull to make a pandemic treaty with 5 core principles. Okay, so at the top, you're going to have to just choose 5 core principles. Of all of those, you may have to create something of your own, but it's going to be a collaborative effort with the folks in your breakout room. And so we'll have 3 groups, and you're about to get a link to that. Just hold on, and whoops, I'll stop sharing, and I will send you all the link to the space, and then you will get, as I mentioned, you will be, well, maybe cut, I don't know if you can cut and paste this link or just take someone, we can put it back also in your breakout rooms, because you'll need it in your breakout room, I believe. So I'll let you guys send to the breakout rooms, and we can post this same link in all of the breakouts. So you should have a green, a blue, and a yellow. 1, 2, and 3. 1 is yellow, 2 is blue, 3 is green. Okay, I'll let you guys go. So may I, this is Melody, may I show everyone the screen to show where we found out, and let people just briefly talk about it before we, so they can have a little bit of finding out what each group did?
So yes,
Let's do 1 minute report back, 1 person per group.
yes, 1 more minute.
Okay. I told them all, I told them all to get out and come back here. So hopefully we have a, let's see.
Yeah, try to give as much time as possible.
Yeah, there were clearly lots of good discussions going on in the different groups. So that was really great.
Yeah,
That was pretty fun to see.
Yeah, really great tool. I
That's
never
great.
used it that way. I really love it.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
Mhm.
yeah, thanks for suggesting mural. I've never used it before.
And let's see. I will share the final space once I see people. Oh, they're still in there.
Yeah, they're coming in now, coming back. Yeah.
Come on, folks. Okay. Let's go to yellow.
So who was room 1?
So this is the yellow group.
Okay.
I've got the yellow group up for whenever that yellow group is here, whomever wants to talk about it once we have everyone back out of the rooms. I'll let you figure that out, Adriana.
Yeah, I think everyone is back now.
Okay, so yellow group, who wants to say what you guys came up with and how it went? I mean, just not too much, but just feel free to list them and say how that was.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to speak for the yellow group. We are kind of looking at specifically how, I guess, what little parts would be addressed by, specifically COVID. So the first one, kind of to promote the scientific cooperation of all kind of active people in this would be kind of between the different countries and the different kind of corporations that are behind making the vaccines and making that available for everybody else. As a part of this kind of overall aspect of it, would be kind of the freedom of the access of the inspectors in order to make sure that, the process of the vaccine development and the information is flowing between all the partners or all the parties, be it countries and companies and, governments and whatnot. And then and tie that in as well would be the partnership for the goals and having that same kind of, hold on, sorry, let me move my thing. All right, same kind of outcomes, which I think is one of the parts that's kind of failing would be right now, especially with COVID, would be both kind of the overall goal would be, like, what is the goal for the kind of the world and the countries and the companies, right? So I would imagine the countries would have to almost appease the companies in order to develop the vaccines that make it accessible to everybody. And then that would also require kind of a good education, a good PR, a good message, because the main kind of shortcoming, at least right now, especially with this new variant, would be in order to limit these mutations, we would have to have a greater vaccination rate. In order to achieve that kind of on a global scale, we would need more vaccines for poorer countries, as the more industrialized, wealthy countries would already have those kind of in mass production. And that shortfall, specifically in Africa, has caused these mutations and, obviously more variants, because viruses are going to do this anyway. in order to limit that, we would need kind of a lot of all of these kind of
Yeah.
I don't know, goals, I guess,
Awesome.
promoting the cooperation aspect for the inspectors and partnerships, and kind of, I guess it's quality education, but also kind of PR.
Right.
So in order to have a better message.
Well, thank you. And I did mention to my group, which is just about to come up, thank you very much, Ben, that one of the things we're trying to show you here is that science diplomacy is often being given a bunch of tasks that you don't understand and way too little time and a lot of uncertainty, but being told, you're a scientist, figure this out. These are scientific issues. So we decided to put you in that little blender. And I said, it does get better because you start to learn all the issues, you start to learn all the people, you start to learn people you can call, you start to learn the acronyms. But until then, it's a little challenging, and that's what we wanted to put you through. So thank you for doing that with us. Who would like to report out for the blue team? I don't have anyone. Somebody.
I can talk if you want. Okay. So first, we chose really fast, like international scientific cooperation, because we think that's important for like everyone to like work into one goal. Then recognize the voice of developing countries, as I think it was mentioned here that like what happened in Africa, that maybe they weren't like allowed, or like they didn't facilitate their money for them to like develop their own vaccine, so that doesn't happen. Kind of like recognizing the voice of developing countries. Reducing inequalities. So the first one, the recognized voice in developing countries, that's like more like country-based, right? And then reducing inequalities, that's more like human-based. So that would be like gender, race, right? So we wanted to have a distinction between both. Also industry and innovation and infrastructure. Well, obviously we want to have like various facilities, infrastructure for developing vaccines or research in COVID-19. And we know that an example is just like distributing the vaccines would cause disputes in countries, right? I mean, we don't want wars for vaccines. So we want to resolve disputes by peaceful means. Yeah.
I was muted, sorry. Excellent, thank you so much. And look how different that was. And think of if you had to get together and resolve these, just so you know, science diplomacy is, then you have to resolve different teams having different ideas. We're going to the green group. And whomever would like to speak, thank you very much, Diana, Laura. So here's the green group. Who would like to speak for you guys?
Hi, that's me. We have a group.
Thank you, Patricia.
Okay, yes. Yeah, actually, I think it's kind of several aspects we have in common with the other groups, but in a mixed way. First, we want to highlight the importance to recognize this is an interest of all humankind to resolve the problem of the pandemics. Another aspect we were going to highlight is the prioritizing the sustainable development, considering that it's well recognized that kind of pandemic should be managed on the social part, that is economical part is also highly important. And also this has an important component on the environmental, as we know, is a zoonosis too. And for the considering the fighting of the inequalities, to reduce inequalities, thinking in gender and race and all the different aspects and the intersectionality of these ones. Also highlighting the need of international scientific cooperation, not only for promoting it, but to really having that international scientific cooperation, and the recognition of the voice of developing countries on the same side of the blue group, that we know that the thing of the pandemic is like when we were a little bit better, things we have left behind several countries, developing countries, now we're having the pandemics again. So that would be the summary.
Thank you so much. I'll stop sharing. I really appreciate everyone doing this work. It was really, really wonderful to see. And Adriana, I'll turn it back to you and the team.
think you're muted, Adriana.
Oh,
Okay, sorry, I thought you were going to say something. So I think we're already a little over time, so I'm just gonna say thank you to everybody for joining today. I really enjoyed all of your talks, and the breakouts seemed like they went really well, and I'll go back and look through all of the exercises. So thank you so much for facilitating that as well. And thanks to all of you for being here. I just want to remind you again of our call for papers and events upcoming related to the issue. So please sign up, and we look forward to your submission to the special issue. And thanks again for joining.
thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys. Thank you for the
Thank you.
invitation. It was great to go through the exercise with you. Really
Thanks,
love the
everyone.
3 different boards.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really nice. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.